June 6, 1944, 6:30 a.m. The phone rang at Berchtesgaden. Hitler's aide hesitated. Should he wake the Führer for this? Allied ships filled the horizon off Normandy, thousands of them. The invasion everyone expected was finally here, but Hitler's staff didn't wake him. Why? Because German high command was convinced this couldn't be the real invasion. The real invasion would come at Calais, led by the Allies' most dangerous general, George S. Patton. Right now, at this very moment, Patton was in England commanding a massive phantom army preparing to strike the Pas de Calais. German intelligence had confirmed it. Reconnaissance had verified it. The entire German defensive strategy was built around stopping Patton at Calais. So when the largest armada in history appeared at Normandy without Patton, German commanders made a fatal calculation. This must be a diversion. The real attack was still coming. What they said in those critical first hours, how completely they'd been deceived by the most successful ruse in military history, and the moment they realized Patton's entire army was a fiction that had paralyzed Germany's best divisions, while the real invasion succeeded. This is that story. January-June 1944. While Eisenhower planned the real D-Day at Normandy, an equally elaborate operation unfolded in southeast England. Operation Fortitude, the most sophisticated deception in military history, had one primary objective: convince German high command that Patton would lead the main invasion at Pas de Calais, not Normandy. The deception required making Patton, freshly relieved from combat command after the slapping incidents in Sicily, into the centerpiece of German paranoia. Allied intelligence knew Germans considered Patton the most dangerous Allied general. Rommel feared him. German intelligence tracked his movements obsessively. Wehrmacht commanders assumed no major Allied operation would occur without Patton leading it. Operation Fortitude exploited this German fixation completely. Patton was placed in command of 1st United States Army Group, WWII, an army that existed only on paper and in German imagination. But the illusion was elaborate. Fake radio traffic suggesting massive forces, inflatable tanks and landing craft visible to German aerial reconnaissance, actual troop movements carefully orchestrated to suggest buildup opposite Calais, and Patton himself making public appearances in southeast England, inspecting his phantom forces. German intelligence took the bait completely. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht (OKW) situation reports from spring 1944 show German high command tracking WWII with intense focus. One April report stated, enemy army group under General Patton continues concentration in southeast England opposite Pas de Calais, force estimated at 50 divisions. This represents primary invasion threat. Patton's presence indicates Calais remains probable invasion site. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding German forces in Western Europe, built his defensive strategy entirely around Fortitude's fiction. His strongest divisions, including several SS Panzer divisions, were positioned to counter the expected Calais invasion. When subordinates suggested reinforcing Normandy's defenses, von Rundstedt refused. Normandy was secondary. Calais was where Patton would strike. Rommel, commanding Army Group B defending the French coast, shared this assessment. In May 1944 inspection reports, Rommel wrote, "The enemy will attempt diversionary landings to draw our reserves away from Calais before Patton's main assault. We must not be deceived by secondary operations. The decisive battle will be fought at Pas de Calais against Patton's army group." Hitler himself was convinced. German intelligence briefs presented to the Führer throughout spring 1944 emphasized Patton's WWII as the critical threat. Hitler, who often overruled his generals on military matters, agreed completely with their assessment. Patton at Calais was the invasion to fear and stop. Everything else was distraction. Patton, meanwhile, chafed at his role. He wanted to command real forces in real combat, not phantom armies in a deception operation. But Eisenhower made clear, Patton's job was to be visible, to command WWII convincingly, to keep German attention focused on Calais. Patton's ego, his reputation, his very presence, these were weapons as important as any division. In one conversation, Eisenhower told Patton, "George, right now you're keeping more German divisions out of Normandy than any general actually fighting there. I need you to stay in England and continue being the threat Germans think you are." The deception worked because it aligned with everything German commanders believed about Allied strategy and Patton's importance. Germans assumed Allies would choose the shortest route across the Channel, Calais. They assumed Allies would employ their best general, Patton, in the main operation. Both assumptions seemed logical, professional, based on sound military reasoning. Both were exactly what Allied planners wanted Germans to believe. As June approached, German confidence in the Calais hypothesis grew stronger, not weaker. Every intelligence report confirmed Fussagi's presence. Every reconnaissance flight showed equipment buildup opposite Calais. Patton's movements were tracked and interpreted as final preparations for invasion. German defensive positions, troop deployments, and contingency plans all reflected absolute certainty. When the invasion came, it would be Patton at Calais. June 6, 1944, 6:30 a.m. Reports of massive amphibious landings in Normandy reached German high command. The initial reaction wasn't alarm. It was confusion mixed with certainty that this couldn't be the main event. Why? Because Patton wasn't there. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of operations at OKW, received the first reports at Hitler's Berchtesgaden headquarters. His response, recorded by staff officers present, captured German thinking. Normandy landings appear significant, but probably diversionary. Fussag under Patton remains intact in England. Main invasion still expected at Calais. Recommend maintaining defensive positions around Pas-de-Calais. At von Rundstedt's headquarters in Paris, the same logic prevailed. When staff officers reported the scale of Normandy landings, thousands of ships, massive airborne drops, 5 invasion beaches, von Rundstedt's reaction was to check intelligence updates on Patton's location. Fussag was still in England. Patton hadn't moved. Therefore, Normandy couldn't be the main invasion. Von Rundstedt's chief of staff, General Günther Blumentritt, later described their reasoning. We knew the Allies had sufficient forces for a major diversion before the real invasion. Normandy appeared to be that diversion. The decisive thrust would come at Calais, where geography favored attackers and where Patton's army waited. We'd been preparing for Calais for months. All intelligence pointed to Calais. One landing at Normandy didn't change strategic reality. Most critically, Hitler wasn't awakened until late morning. His staff, believing Normandy was diversionary, saw no reason to wake him for what they assumed was preliminary operation. When finally informed, Hitler's first question was about Patton. Where was he? Still in England? Then Normandy was indeed a feint, and the real invasion was still coming at Calais. This German certainty had catastrophic consequences. Throughout June 6th, as American, British, and Canadian forces fought desperately to establish beachheads at Normandy, German panzer divisions that could have crushed the invasion remained near Calais. They sat immobilized, waiting for Patton's attack that would never come. Von Rundstedt refused requests to move these reserves to Normandy. Until Patton moved, reserves stayed at Calais. German commanders on the ground at Normandy, facing the reality of massive Allied assault, sent increasingly desperate requests for reinforcements. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored force initially near Normandy, counterattacked, but couldn't push Allies back into the sea alone. Rommel, who'd rushed to Normandy from Germany, demanded release of reserves. Von Rundstedt refused, Jodl refused, Hitler refused, all for the same reason. This was a diversion. Patton was coming at Calais. German radio intercepts of Allied communications were carefully analyzed for any mention of Patton or Fussag. Nothing indicated Patton had moved from England. Nothing suggested Fussag was involved in Normandy. This absence of evidence was interpreted as confirming evidence. Patton was being held back for the real invasion still to come. By afternoon of June 6th, Allied forces had secured tenuous beachheads at all 5 landing sites. The invasion was succeeding, but barely. If German panzer reserves near Calais had been released that morning, they might have reached Normandy in time to drive Allies back into the Channel. They remained at Calais, guarding against Patton's Phantom Army. June 7-14, 1944. As Allied forces in Normandy expanded their beachhead and began pushing inland, German high command slowly, painfully began to realize they'd been deceived on a scale beyond imagination. But the realization came too slowly, delayed by the same certainty about Patton that had paralyzed German response on D-Day. For over a week after D-Day, German commanders clung to the Calais hypothesis. Intelligence reports continued analyzing Fussag's positions, trying to determine when Patton would launch his assault. Von Rundstedt's situation briefings still identified Calais as the primary threat. Panzer divisions remained positioned to counter the expected invasion at Pas-de-Calais rather than reinforcing Normandy. But cracks appeared in German certainty. By June 10th, with 6 Allied divisions ashore at Normandy and no second invasion at Calais, some German officers began questioning the assessment. Was it possible, barely possible, that Normandy was the real invasion, that Patton's Fusag was the diversion, not Normandy. German intelligence officers analyzed Fusag communications with new scrutiny. Something seemed wrong. The radio traffic, which had been so abundant before D-Day, continued but with patterns that closer analysis suggested might be artificial. Reconnaissance flights over southeast England, examined more carefully, showed equipment that might be inflatable deceptions rather than real tanks and landing craft. The evidence had been there all along, but German preconceptions about Patton's importance had prevented them from seeing it. The moment of full realization varied among German commanders. For some, it came June 12th, when Allied forces in Normandy linked all 5 beaches into one continuous front. This was no diversionary raid. For others, it came mid-June, when intelligence confirmed American divisions identified in Normandy belonged to units German intelligence had tracked as part of Fusag. Fusag was in Normandy, which meant Fusag had never existed as army group at all. The most devastating realization was about Patton. He wasn't coming to Calais. He hadn't commanded the Normandy invasion because he'd never commanded anything real. For months, Patton had been a fiction's commander, and Germany's entire defensive strategy had been built around stopping a fiction. The most successful military deception in history had paralyzed German response at the war's most critical moment. Von Rundstedt's reaction, when the full scope of fortitude became clear, was recorded by his aide. The field marshal said little, but his expression showed complete professional humiliation. We'd been fooled completely. Patton's name alone had kept our best divisions away from the decisive battle. We'd prepared brilliantly to counter a threat that never existed while the real invasion succeeded. Hitler's response was predictable: rage at intelligence officers for failing to detect the deception, accusations that generals had been incompetent or traitorous. But privately, German officers acknowledged they'd been beaten by superior strategic planning. One staff officer wrote in his diary, "The Allies used our own assumptions against us. They knew we feared Patton, so they made Patton our focus while conducting the real invasion elsewhere. We fell for it completely." July 1944. Having kept German divisions paralyzed around Calais during the critical weeks when they could have crushed the Normandy beachhead, Patton was finally released from his deception role to command real forces. On July 28th, Patton's Third Army became operational in France, and German commanders who'd feared Phantom Patton now faced the real thing. The irony was savage. For months, Germans had prepared for Patton at Calais. Now Patton was in Normandy, breaking out of the beachhead, and German forces were out of position to stop him. The defensive strategy built around containing Patton at Calais had left German forces vulnerable to Patton in Normandy. The deception's success compounded into operational catastrophe. When German intelligence confirmed Patton was commanding Third Army in Normandy, the implications hit like physical blow. OKW situation reports from late July show the realization. General Patton now commands Operational Army in Normandy Breakthrough Sector. Enemy forces under Patton advancing rapidly. This confirms Normandy was main invasion. Calais threat was deception. Our defensive strategy was based on false intelligence. Patton's Third Army immediately demonstrated why Germans had feared him. His operational tempo exceeded anything German commanders anticipated. Third Army advanced faster, moved more aggressively, and exploited breakthrough more effectively than Germans thought possible. The general they'd expected at Calais was racing across France, and German forces couldn't establish defensive lines quickly enough to stop him. German commanders who'd studied Patton theoretically now faced him operationally. His tactics: rapid movement, aggressive pursuit, refusing to allow enemy to establish defensive positions, matched everything Germans had analyzed, but proved more devastating in execution than analysis suggested. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich von Luttwitz, whose forces faced Third Army, reported, "Patton employs tactics similar to our own panzer operations at their most aggressive. We created the doctrines he's using against us. He learned them well." More painful was the knowledge that German forces positioned around Calais could have stopped Third Army's advance if they'd been properly positioned from the start. SS Panzer divisions that spent June waiting for Patton at Calais were now racing west, trying to catch Third Army. They arrived piecemeal, exhausted from forced marches, and were defeated in detail by American forces that had weeks to establish superiority in Normandy. German post-action reports from August 1944 repeatedly referenced the fortitude deception and its consequences. One corps commander wrote, "We prepared for 6 months to defeat Patton at Calais. When he appeared in Normandy instead, our preparations were worthless. By the time we repositioned forces to counter him, American armies were too strong to stop. The deception didn't just succeed on D-Day, it created conditions for Third Army's devastating advance. Post-war interrogations of German commanders revealed the full impact of Operation Fortitude and Patton's role in history's most successful military deception. Senior German officers, analyzing their defeat, consistently identified the Fortitude deception as the decisive factor enabling Allied success in France. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of OKW, told Allied interrogators, "We built our entire Western defense around stopping Patton at Calais. When the invasion came at Normandy without Patton, we assumed it was diversionary. We were so convinced Patton would command the main invasion that we couldn't accept Normandy was that invasion. By the time we realized our mistake, Allied armies were too strong to dislodge." This deception was perhaps the Allies' most brilliant achievement of the war. Von Rundstedt, in his interrogation, was blunt. Using Patton as deception weapon was masterstroke. "We knew he was Allies' most aggressive general. We assumed he would command their most important operation. The Allies used our own professional military judgment against us. They made Patton visible at Calais precisely because they knew we'd focus there. I must acknowledge, as military deception, it was flawlessly executed. German intelligence officers were particularly devastated. Oberst Baron Alexis von Roen, who'd analyzed Allied buildups and concluded Fusag was real, later admitted, "Every piece of evidence pointed to Calais. Patton's presence, the equipment buildup, the radio traffic, all confirmed Calais. We didn't know every piece of evidence was fabricated specifically to confirm what we already believed. We were victims of confirmation bias on massive scale. The Allies understood our thinking process better than we understood it ourselves." Rommel, before his forced suicide in October 1944, told confidants that Fortitude's success with Patton demonstrated how completely Germans had underestimated Allied strategic sophistication. "We thought Americans were tactically competent but strategically naive. The Patton deception proved the opposite. They executed strategic deception that would have impressed Clausewitz himself, using their most feared general as bait to paralyze our best divisions while conducting the real invasion elsewhere. This showed strategic thinking we hadn't credited to Americans. The numbers tell the story. Over a dozen German divisions, including elite SS Panzer units, remained around Pas-de-Calais during June and early July, when they could have counterattacked in Normandy. These forces might have destroyed the Allied beachhead if released immediately. They stayed at Calais, waiting for Patton's Phantom Army. When finally moved to Normandy, they arrived too late and too depleted to make strategic difference. In post-war historical analysis, German military historians consistently rate Operation Fortitude as one of the war's decisive operations. General der Infanterie Hans Speidel wrote, "D-Day succeeded for many reasons: Allied material superiority, air dominance, determined soldiers. But the strategic reason was Operation Fortitude." By fixating German defenses on Patton at Calais, the Allies ensured Normandy invasion would face weaker opposition than we could have concentrated there. Patton's value as deception weapon exceeded his considerable value as battlefield commander. Perhaps the final word belongs to General Blumentritt, von Rundstedt's chief of staff. For months, Patton's presence in England paralyzed an entire German army group. Then he appeared in Normandy and shattered German defenses across France. He beat us twice, once by not being where we expected, once by being where we couldn't stop him. This was the most effective use of a single general in military history. The greatest trick Patton ever pulled was making an entire enemy army prepare for an attack that never came, while the real invasion succeeded. Stories like these, where perception mattered more than reality, where what the enemy thought determined everything, show that wars are won in minds before they're won on battlefields.